All right, here we go. Let's talk about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the view that one choice is morally better than another if it brings about a greater total amount of happiness. So let's say I'm at the bodega and I'm trying to buy a soda, and then I think, you know what, why didn't I just shoplift it? Well, how would a utilitarian think about whether it's the right choice to pay for the soda or to shoplift it? Well, you'd look at all the people who are affected by your choices and you'd add up the pros and cons. So if I pay the soda, I'm pay for the soda, I'm out $1, and that makes me sad. But I get my soda, and so I'm kind of okay. And the store owner is up $1, so they feel pretty good about it. If I shoplift the soda, you might think, well, I get to keep my dollar. The store owner misses it, but maybe the store owner is richer than me. Maybe they don't care about the dollar as much as I do. And so, maybe that's the best thing to do. Since the dollar matters more to me than to the store owner, I should shoplift it. But then you think a little bit about the long-term consequences of stealing. On the one hand, of course, if I shoplift it, there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to get caught, and then I'm not going to get my soda, and I might get in some sort of trouble. Maybe I won't be able to shop at that store again. But also, store owners take into account the rates at which items are shoplifted from their stores. So when I shoplift, I raise prices for everyone else, both because the store owner has to replenish their own stock, but also because when store owners see an uptick in shoplifting, they tend to take sort of extra measures out to secure their goods, to install security cameras and stuff, and that ultimately comes out of consumers' pockets. Okay, so the likelihood that my shoplifting is going to lead a store owner to increase the security, to install a new security camera is pretty small, but it's significant. It's significant. And so when you look at the long-term consequences, sort of downstream, especially the sort of probabilistic consequences, the likely consequences of shoplifting, it seems like shoplifting has a bunch of sort of hidden costs that, just paying for the soda doesn't. Okay, so this is a utilitarian explanation of why shoplifting is usually wrong. Although, I'll leave it as an exercise to you. Maybe you could imagine some situations, really bad store owners, that sort of thing, where shoplifting might be a good idea. But, I don't want to get fired, so I won't go into details about that. Here are a few things to note about utilitarianism. So the first thing is that utilitarianism is a forward-looking theory. The only thing that matters from a utilitarian point of view is the future consequences of your actions. So if you're trying to figure out what's right or wrong, you don't look to the past. You don't look to, for example, what somebody intended to do, what their motives were. You also don't look to, at least on the normal way we think about these things, what somebody deserves, what somebody did in the past to deserve some outcome or other. You only look to the future, to how your actions affect people's happiness. Second, utilitarianism is an egalitarian theory. It's a theory that places a great emphasis on equality. But what does equality mean for utilitarians? Equality means that everybody's happiness matters equally. My happiness matters just as much as yours, matters just as much as, my mom's, matters just as much as some strangers, matters just as much as somebody, halfway around the world. Lastly, utilitarianism requires us to quantify happiness, okay? If I'm choosing between two options, I should pick the one that leads to a greater total amount of happiness. Well, how do you figure out whether something leads to a greater total amount of happiness? This is a really hard problem, and I don't have the ultimate answer to it. But a lot of the time, when you want to quantify happiness, you can ask, how much would somebody pay for something? So if somebody would pay $1 for a certain outcome, you might think they get $1 worth of happiness out of it. If they would pay $1 to avoid that outcome, that means they get negative $1 worth of happiness from this. So this won't always work. There are certain ways that people's the prices that people assign to things are sort of arbitrary or irrational, but this works pretty well. So, especially in a business context where the costs and benefits associated with the various outcomes of your actions often already come with prices attached, this makes utilitarianism a relatively easy to apply theory. So especially when you're talking about financial decisions whose costs and benefits already come with dollar amounts attached to them. Okay. Mill doesn't go into great detail about this, but I think it's worth saying, why would anybody want to be a utilitarian? Confession, I'm a utilitarian, but, I'm open-minded and I'm not going to try to shove utilitarianism down your throats over the course of this class. But why am I a utilitarian? Well, there are two arguments for utilitarianism that I find really convincing. One is that happiness is the only ultimately valuable thing. And, okay, you might think, yeah, okay, I can get on board with that. If you couldn't experience happiness, then why would anything be worth doing at all? Okay, yeah, I can get on board with that. Okay, happiness is the only ultimately valuable thing. Everybody's happiness matters equally. I know my happiness sort of matters to me just because of human nature more than it matters to you, and vice versa. But I can see that in some sort of objective or universal point of view, everyone's happiness is sort of on a par. There's no reason why, as philosophers sometimes say, from the point of view of the universe, your happiness should count more than mine. So happiness is the only ultimately valuable thing. Everyone's happiness matters equally. And lastly, you might think, one action is better than another, it's more valuable than another morally if it creates more value. And if happiness is the only ultimately valuable thing, that means that one action is morally better than another if it creates more happiness, which is utilitarianism. So that's one argument for utilitarianism that I find pretty convincing. Another argument that I find pretty convincing is that look at all of the things that we value in everyday life. We value honesty, we value integrity, we value being a good friend. But also, all of these values come with certain limits, and they come into conflict with one another. Sometimes the honest thing to do and the being a good friend thing to do seem to come into conflict. Your friend asks you for your honest opinion about the new song they wrote, and you think the song sucks, but you don't want to tell them because that makes you a bad friend. So sometimes the sort of ordinary everyday values that we walk around with come into conflict, and they seem to be limited in scope. Being honest doesn't always make sense. Being a good friend doesn't always make sense, especially when these values come into conflict with other values. How do you decide what the limits are of these values, though? How do you decide what to do when they come into conflict? Well, utilitarianism has an answer to that. Utilitarianism explains the limits of our values and of our sort of everyday, heuristic, rough and ready values, and resolves the conflicts between them. What should you do when honesty and being a good friend come into conflict? Well, a pretty good answer is you should do whatever increases the total amount of happiness in the world more. That is to say, you should do the utilitarian thing. Okay. Those are a couple of arguments for utilitarianism that I find pretty convincing. But I know that there are a lot of objections to utilitarianism that people find equally or more convincing. So there are some limits to utilitarian moral thinking that I want to set out. One of them we already have on the table, which is that happiness is hard to quantify, perhaps in some cases impossible to quantify, and utilitarianism requires us to quantify it. So utilitarianism is at the very least going to be hard to apply when the quantities of happiness that we're reasoning about are hard to compare, and maybe impossible to apply in principle in cases where those it doesn't make sense to quantify happiness. Okay, that's one problem with utilitarianism. Another problem with utilitarianism is that sometimes it will require individuals or small groups of people to make great sacrifices for the interests of a much larger group. One sort of counterexample, which is sometimes brought up, is some people think that if you are a healthy person and you go to the doctor and the doctor is a utilitarian, they might say, why don't I just harvest this person's organs? I see that person over there needs a liver, that person needs a kidney, that person needs whatever. Oh, I forgot the owl. I thought I'd take out an owl every time I raise objections to a moral theory. So here's the objection owl. Okay, so like the objection owl was saying, maybe a utilitarian doctor would harvest the organs of a healthy patient and donate them to a bunch of people who needed healthy organs. But you might say, well, yeah, that might contribute to the greater total amount of happiness because it saves a bunch of people's lives, but it's a violation of that patient's rights. People just deserve a certain basic amount of fair or decent treatment, and you can't just go around harvesting people's organs. Okay. Lastly, utilitarianism is, I think, intuitively a little too egalitarian, a little too focused on equality for some people. After all, you might think, it's really important to me that I'm a good friend, and being a good friend means treating my friends with more sort of concern and care and respect and taking into their account their interests than other people. So being a good friend means caring about your friends and their happiness more than you care about other people's. Being a good son perhaps means caring about your parents' happiness more than you care about strangers' happiness. Being a good girlfriend or boyfriend or partner or whatever means caring about your romantic partner's happiness more than you care about other people's. So wouldn't utilitarianism require us to be bad friends? Okay, I'm going to put this down. There are ways of responding to all of these objections, but one possible response is to look for another moral theory. So that's what we're going to do in the next video.